block parties, other places where I've lived. I'm always that guy, that wants to get everyone together. And so that's been something that I've really enjoyed. I love the topic of moving from social capital to civic muscle, civic capital. That's something that we talk about a lot at the National Civic League. And what I enjoy most about working at the National Civic League, where I've been now for 10 years, is that we focus on things that work. We focus on success, and we look for models around the country of people working together to solve problems. We have a program called the All-America City Award, where we recognize 10 communities every year for working collectively to address issues in their community. And that's coming up here at the end of June. So it's really a lot of fun to be able to, even in these days when the national picture sometimes seems pretty miserable, to be able to highlight all the good things happening at the local level. Um, my mantra is what a president once said is that there's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed by what's right with America. And that's what we focus on is what's right with America, which is often at the city level, county level, neighborhood level, and block.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you for that. What a great quote, great reminder, especially in kind of a feel a sense of a age of disruption that we feel like we're in their season. Um, yeah, so maybe you could share a little bit about maybe what does you talked about civic muscle or civic capital. I don't know if you could share, you say that small scale, that block level, neighborhood level, um, municipal level, but at the small scale, what does that look like, that civic capital?
Sure. Well, and not to parse words, but I see a difference between social capital and civic capital. Social capital is the relationships among individuals, and it's what Robert Putnam wrote about in Bowling Alone, is that we have relationships among us individually. And Putnam talks about how that is fading because we don't have as many formal organizations like bowling leagues. I tend to disagree because I think there are a lot of informal activities going on that we don't necessarily account for. There's a lot of social capital among neighbors, among people at work, among people who are watching their kids play soccer or some other sport. There's social capital uh, that is really just kind of a natural product of people living in a neighborhood. Um, Unless there are barriers like safety issues, it's something that happens naturally. I find that in my neighborhood, for example, people who walk dogs tend to know each other because they stop as they're walking by and greet each other by talking about their dogs. And we have a park where people take their dogs and play, and people with dogs. It's a whole sort of sub-neighborhood, sub-community within the neighborhood of people who have dogs. And there are fewer people who have kids in strollers, but they also tend to stop and talk to each other and get to know each other. So to some degree, there are these different layers within the community. Then there's technology, of course. Many people are on nextdoor.com, and granted, that can sometimes be a place um, for negative conversation as opposed to positive. But it's still building social capital among people in the neighborhood. You can encourage social capital, as many people here, I'm sure, know, and maybe you work in this area, placemaking, having gathering places, dealing with, environmental design so that, you know, garages are not the first place that people pull into when they come home. Neighborhood safety can encourage social capital. So social capital is sort of that relationship among neighborhoods. Now, civic capital, on the other hand, or civic muscle, is what you do with that social capital. It's the capacity for community action or problem solving. It's the relationships, but it's more of an active process of people working together. I used to roll my eyes whenever people talked about Alexis de Tocqueville and what he wrote about America when he came here early in the 19th century. But if you actually go back and read some of his writing, it's really fascinating. Um, and observing that in the US and the United States, when there's a problem, people pull together and solve the problem. If there's a fire burns down a building, people come together to put it back. And I don't know if this is always a positive thing, but it often results in the formation of a committee of some kind or an association. So it's a natural thing for us to gather and solve problems. And I think it's partly due to the fact that in the US, government doesn't solve all of our problems, that we often need that sort of non-governmental angle, whether it's through nonprofits or neighborhood groups, to address problems. So that's kind of my short answer to um, civic capital or civic muscle in neighborhoods. And I think what we're mostly wanting to talk about today is how do you help nurture that civic capital or that civic muscle um, within neighborhoods. And I think it's an interesting challenge, and I think a lot of folks here probably work in that area. So it's good stuff.
Yeah, no, you bring that up. I'd love to move into that conversation. I mean, you mentioned, you can't build up social capital, and I know you've worked a lot. You said earlier, your main identity is the gatherer of people around the block party. Um, so I don't know, maybe you could talk about ways to build that social capital, and then I'd love to move into that conversation. Then how do you move from that social capital, those activities, and have you seen that then produce the kind of public dialogue out of which you can build that action, that movement toward solving our problems like collectively? So, but yeah,
Yeah.
love to hear more from you.
Well, and I certainly applaud those who are on the call who work at the neighborhood and block level. The National Civic League, we tend to work a little bit more at the community-wide level, city-wide level. And we created something called the Civic Index as a way of describing what we call civic capital. Um, and we have different components that we attribute to communities. And Megan, if you bring up our slide, um, we define civic capital as the relationships, whether it's formal relationships or informal relationships, among people, among people in the community, not just people, but also businesses, nonprofits. And it's the capacities that these communities have to make decisions and solve problems. It's not always government that solves problems. You know, I was in elective office for 18 years, and I remind people that political leaders are often like television anchors, news anchors. You know, we read what you bring us to read. And most of the solutions or most of the ideas that I had as an elected official didn't come out of my brain. People brought them to me. And the ones that succeeded had a big coalition behind them. So it's often citizens, it's businesses, it's community members that come up with the ideas and bring them to political leaders. And Megan, on our next slide, we have some of the elements of civic capital as we see it for a community as a whole. And I won't spend a lot of time on this because we're really talking more at the neighborhood level here. But having residents who are engaged in a community, having community leadership, again, in a city that is inclusive, institutions that are collaborative. Um, Diversity and equity isn't just about race or ethnicity, it's also about renters versus homeowners, youth and older adults, people with different opinions. A culture of engagement is sort of, you know, this is the way we do things. Authentic communication can be a newspaper, but it can also be social media and other tools for communicating. And the one I want to focus most on is the shared vision and values, because that's important in a neighborhood as well. It starts with a sense of identity or belonging. Does your neighborhood have a name? Does it have boundaries? Um, do people have a sense of what's allowed in a neighborhood or what is appreciated in a neighborhood? And you often get this at a block party where people stand around talking to each other about, you know, what are we going to do about that neighbor down the block that never mows their lawn? I love the flowers that you planted in your yard. Those are values that are coming out that we're sharing with each other. And um, I mean, I moved to a house once and I had dogs that sometimes barked. And I talked to my neighbor. I said, I'm sorry if my dogs, bark too much and bother you. And she said, don't worry about it. Everybody in our neighborhood has dogs. This is a dog neighborhood. And that told me right off the bat that it was acceptable that my dogs barked periodically. In some neighborhoods, that's different. People call the city immediately when people's dogs are barking too much. So there are sort of values that we have that are somewhat informal. Do people pick up after their dogs? Um, do people call when there's something unusual in the neighborhood? These are the values that we have. So thank you, Megan, and I'll turn back to the regular video. Um, as far as what can we do, and we can spend quite a bit of time on this, um, to encourage civic muscle or to build civic capital. There are so many things that we could talk about. Some of it happens naturally. It's often a matter of necessity. Like during COVID, I think many of us saw um, sort of mutual aid pick up. In Washington, D.C., for example, there was a D.C. mutual aid organization that started at the neighborhood level and became citywide, where people were helping get supplies to other people. We see this after disasters often. After Hurricane Katrina, there was a kind of a loose-knit neighborhood association in the lower Ninth Ward that became much stronger because people came together and they said, no, we're not leaving. We're staying here and we're going to build this neighborhood back. And so they began sort of this community organization called the Lower Ninth Ward Center for Sustainable Engagement and Development that became quite powerful, not only in sustainability and helping to build back, but also in jobs and helping people get what they needed in this fairly low income area. So necessity, I think, breeds a lot of that civic muscle. Sometimes it's a negative, like something is going to happen that we want to keep from happening, crime or a development. And that's where the whole NIMBY phenomena comes in. That's probably the easiest way to organize people. We used to joke that if you really wanted people to show up at a neighborhood meeting, you just put, that there's a highway that's planned for the middle of our neighborhood. Um, Something negative will get people to show up. Unfortunately, um, sometimes more than something positive. But there have been so many examples of people doing things positively. There's a neighborhood in Portland, East Portland, where people were gathering on a regular basis, just sort of socially. And they said, our neighborhood doesn't have the same access to parks as other parts of the city. The kids don't have safe streets. So they talked the city into buying an old jail site nearby, and they converted it to an off-road bike park. Um, so often, if there's a problem that neighbors see that they can organize around, and they can take that to the city. And like I say, sometimes on the negative side, but it can still turn into a positive. So a lot of it just happens kind of naturally, and we can transition into sort of how to encourage it to happen, but it does happen somewhat naturally on its own.
Yeah, no, yeah, I think. Oh, and thank you, Megan. I was going to suggest we get that out there. And from the website, Megan just dropped the website. Um, in the chat. And could people access the index through the website?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it's free, available on our website. And, it has a questionnaire at the back of it of like 30 questions that your community can ask itself, like, do we have this? Do we have that? It's not quantitative and it's a self-assessment. Um, but you know, ask yourself, do the churches does the faith-based community talk to the business community? Are there natural leaders that are recognized, not just neighborhood leaders or association leaders, but informal leaders?
Mhm.
There's a woman on my block, going back to the block level, who's probably in her 80s, and she's a little unique. A lot of people kind of struggle with her because she's pretty low income. Her yard is a mess. Um, and some people don't appreciate her presence. But every month when they're street sweeping, she puts signs out all around the neighborhood that this is street sweeping day, and to warn people so that they don't get a ticket for having their car parked on the street. So, bless her heart, Julia is a great neighborhood leader, even though maybe not as appreciated by many, and certainly not elected.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, yeah. No, we find too that working at the block level, then the neighborhood level, and then moving into if multiple neighborhoods are working right, it feeds into the city level, and that then you kind of create this pathway for leadership, right? So folks can move into can kind of progressively get more comfortable being in those kinds of positions. Um, but I think, and you kind of hinted at this, but I would love to hear some of those, tips and strategies that you that you may have to share about how do
Yeah.
we keep building. And we often use that term muscle because of this is a learned thing,
Mhm.
and sometimes yes, it's that it is the hurricane or the what have you that forces us to, but hopefully we're working beforehand because we know that if we are building our civic muscle, we're more
Mhm.
resilient in the face of those kinds of things, and we can work together. So what are some tips and tricks that we can do now in our communities, in our neighborhoods, out our blocks, to start to build our muscle?
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. Well, there are certainly roles to play for cities, for counties, for universities, nonprofits, neighborhood associations, um, community foundations. We work a lot with community foundations around the country, and all of those groups can play different roles. Cities often have a formalized process for neighborhood associations. In Portland, Oregon, for example, they've got an Office of Neighborhood Support, and formalized neighborhood associations around the city. They recognized a few years ago that the neighborhood groups weren't really representing some of the people of color and lower income folks, so they also now represent community organizations as well, and they provide support to all of those groups. Um, Other cities do special programs like block party promotions. Denver has a program called Denver Days that I help put together, where for 1 week every summer, late July to early August, they support block parties, um, provide free permits and insurance for block parties to happen, and also neighborhood celebrations or neighborhood activities. Um, I think many cities do this where there's like a block party month or a particular day, or there's National Night Out that a lot of cities participate in. So there's those kinds of programs. There, many cities and foundations have mini grant programs or micro grants. The Knight Foundation works with 26 communities around the country, offering mini grants. I ran a neighborhood association that offered grants of only $100 to blocks for doing something special, and it might be the beginning of a community garden or a party. a block party or something like that. Although block parties are really best when they're potlucks. So don't provide the food. Make people bring the food because that's a conversation starter. Um, Convenings, um, that group that I mentioned in New Orleans, the Ninth Ward, Lower Ninth Ward group, started because the state energy office convened neighbors to talk about, you know, how could they be more, have a more sustainable neighborhood. And so the neighbors got together following that convening and said, you know, we're going to make this happen. Tupelo, Mississippi is famous for sort of bootstraps pulling itself up from post-industrialization. But it was really the Tupelo Foundation that came in and offered um, some grants to help build the capacity of the neighborhood. And that's really important, particularly in lower income neighborhoods or neighborhoods that don't have as much social capital, is to have some active um, community capacity building assistance from the city or a nonprofit association. Um, when I was the neighborhood president of one of my neighborhoods, I've moved around a bit. Um, I went out and found block captains for every block. And it was a matter of knocking on doors until I found somebody who was willing to do it. Um, but there are often informal people who are already kind of acting as block leaders. And by asking people, knocking on doors, you can kind of identify folks like that. You might have heard of Porch Fest. It's a program that started in Ithaca, New York. And I think maybe 50 or so cities do this now, where neighborhoods will, it's kind of hard to describe, but basically musicians play on people's porches. So I went to Decatur, Georgia once where they had Porch Fest in one of their neighborhoods, and they probably had 50 different porches with bands or musicians playing on the porch. And people wandered from yard to yard and they would sit in the yards and listen to the music. And that kind of activity or any kind of festival is a way to get things started. People start talking to each other when they come to things like that. So they have the opportunity, it's an icebreaker, if you will. So those are some of the ways. There's a lot of others that have happened. I see someone's on the call from Chicago. They had a program called On the Table in Chicago where people gathered at homes all around the city on one particular night and talked about. I think it was a pretty open topic most years that they did this, and just broke bread together and talked about things that they cared about.
No, I really appreciate that. I wondered too, and thanks for dropping those links in the Dinford Days and Porch Fest.
Yeah.
I wondered too, Megan, maybe it's worth dropping in there National Good Neighbor Day because that might be an upcoming day that you can plan your first event around, maybe perhaps, or just it's a great excuse to say, hey, this is National Good Neighbor Day, and I know we haven't met, but hey, I would love to meet you and get to know you better. And why don't you come on out? Let's do a potluck or something. So, and there's lots of resources on the National Good Neighbor Day site that get you started as well. So,
When is that, Eric? Do you know? Is it
yeah,
in the summer?
it's the 28th, September 28th every
Oh,
year.
good.
It's National Good
Cool.
Neighbor. Yep. So it's
Yeah.
just, and it's on the books. This is from the Carter administration. It is an official designated day. Um,
That's great.
but, I just wonder in this. So first of all, just thank you, Doug. I mean, lots of just really great ideas, ways to kind of get the activity moving, get the activity going, from block parties to porch fests to what have you, ways to build that those connections and start to get organized. Um, and I appreciate that tip too of like uh, whether it's a porch fest and you're inviting people who have talent to share, or I know Missouri, it's lawn art. They have a lawn art week. Um, or it is inviting people to share the gift of their culinary skills and bring something to the potluck. But there's something about when we're giving that creates a richer, fuller life as well, the process. So I appreciate those tips and ideas.
Well, probably the most important thing is to get out of the way if you're in government or a neighborhood group. Um, I've been the president of neighborhood groups and I've seen them in action, and they can be the most dreadful gatekeepers um, around because, you know, somebody in the neighborhood will have an issue that they care about and they'll go to the neighborhood association, but it's not on the agenda, and the neighborhood group is talking about, PUDs and PBGs and XYZs and NIMBY, and, they're talking about, they're talking shop essentially about um, issues that they care about. But that one person from the community that had the spark to say, I'm going to go to my neighborhood association because I don't like what's happening in my alley.
Mhm.
They don't get listened to. And government can be the same way. A lot of city councils have 3 minutes at the microphone where you can come and talk about whatever you want to the city council. But that's the worst forum for having any kind of civil conversation. You're much, much better off just reaching out to an individual council member and having a conversation. So unfortunately, government can often get in the way. Um, our city requires insurance to have a block party if you're going to block off the street and you have to rent barricades. How suffocating is that? I mean, seriously, is a fire truck really going to try to come through during our block party? And what's the chance of that? So there are cities that offer blanket policies during the block party process to allow people to have block parties. Aurora, Colorado will even lend you a lend barricades. You can borrow barricades from the city and put them out.
Mhm.
So you can either facilitate or get in the way, and it's better to facilitate. And finally, I want to mention leadership programs because a lot of towns have leadership programs, but they don't really create independent leaders. They try to educate people about city processes, but they don't build leadership skills. And whether it's young people or adults, leadership programs that are truly inclusive and skill building can be a really helpful tool.
Yeah, that does make me think. Now, next week we are doing a building another virtual session that's a little bit of a deep dive on community building and some strategies around that, including highlight featuring some communities that are really good at leadership, some communities that are doing really good at block level connection, and anyways, we'll feature some of that. So if you want to join us next week, folks, I know Megan, you'll talk about it a little later, but just want to mention that. But on that question, that leading by stepping back theme that you just touched on, I just want to mention that when we get to questions, so I don't forget this, Chet did ask, how do you engage neighbors? How did you engage with those neighbors to step into that block connector role? So that question came out.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
defining the role specifically and offering help, and not making it too daunting, just to say, kind of inch your way incrementally so that people, you know, all they have to do is X, Y, or Z, that that you know, they they're going to be the communication person, for example, when the city sends out a notice that you let that person know. And these days it might just be by email where they don't go knocking on doors. They just have an email distribution list of the people on their block so that they can send out information as it comes.
Mhm. Yeah, that's great. And to your point, Chet, too. I mean, in a couple months, we'll have another one of our bright spots episodes, and that's going to be the focus. Is because we really do think that block level connection is where we really get the most benefit as communities in terms of like that rebuilding social fabric, rebuilding that sense of trust with each other.
Mhm.
We'll have a special bright spots designated just to that. But the other thing that Doug, that's really fascinating about this conversation, you've been an elected official, and you've worked also as as staff in municipal government. So you give us some tips already, and I want to appreciate that. Meeting one-on-one with your elected official for your ward, however your organize your committee is organized is one tip. Anything else you want to share about how to work with those formal leadership structures in a city or a county, or you know?
Yeah, elected officials are generally pretty approachable if you're coming with an idea. Um, if you're coming with a criticism, maybe less so. But um, I always followed the rule of if someone came in with an idea, I would encourage them to get more people around that idea. Um, if you want to um, deal with, crime in your neighborhood, great. But let's see some other people, bring some other people in, or if you want to pass a new ordinance in the city. Um, and I find myself in this position now that I'm not in office, that one of the issues I care about in my neighborhood is that we have trains that go near our neighborhood, and they have to blow their horns, which is quite loud. And when we first moved here, my wife couldn't sleep because of the train horns. And so I've been trying to get the city to put in a safety zone um, to deal with that problem. Um, and I talked to the council member. Um, but so far, I haven't been able to find a lot of supporters for my idea, because when I talk to other neighbors, they're like, well, we kind of like the train sound. It's kind of nice to hear a train at night, or, it's kind of a nice sound. So I've kind of given up for now, frankly, because, you know, Margaret Mead said it, that um, any group of committed citizens can make a change, but you have to have a group. You can't be there all by yourself.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so folks, again, just a reminder, we're going to open up for a Q&A very soon. I'll ask Doug one more quick question, and then Megan, I think you got a little public service announcement, and so people have time to drop their questions in the Q&A box, and then I'll move to opening those. But I love every time just to ask our guest speakers, what's the next step, right? Or what's that first step if we want to start moving in this direction? What's that first step that you'd recommend? I always think of the formula that I learned in my early kind of organizing days was, change happens when we've got the vision, but we also have the knowledge of that first step. So what would you say what would you encourage people to think about as a first step?
Well, let me zoom out for a second and say that our organization, the National Civic League, one of our missions is to save democracy. And we have done a healthy democracy map where we have identified and inventoried groups around the country that are working on democracy. Democracy is a very broad word that includes civic engagement, um, collaborative problem solving. We've identified 12,000 organizations so far around the country that are working to improve the way that local democracy works. And I know that many people here are working in that realm, and we all recognize that it may not be that all politics are local, it's that all problem solving is local. Um, we could all talk about the lack of problem solving ability, the lack of effectiveness at the federal level, but at the local level, it's happening. And so, and there are hundreds of cities working on issues like climate change, immigration, um, safety, health, education, and succeeding. So it's exciting to think, okay, can we take that to another level down at the neighborhood and block level? Because our individual well-being is mostly affected by what happens on our daily, on a daily basis on our block. I think many people here know the science that's behind um, the, that we're healthier we're better off financially when we know our neighbors. And if we can bridge those connections among people and build trust at the local level, that bubbles up to the national level. So that's why I think our work, all of your work is very important, is that it does work its way up to that national level.
Yeah, thank you for that. Really appreciate it. Yeah, yeah. So, Megan, do you want to come on and just share? I think you got a couple of things you wanted to share, and then we'll get to our questions. And Doug, just to give you, just so you got some time to think about this, the first question I'll go to that someone messaged me about is, what have you learned are the most effective strategies to fund this neighboring work? And who should we target our pitches to for financial support? Cities, foundations, nonprofits, crowdfunding, business groups, chambers. I've seen successful membership models where neighbors are donating to their own cause. So yeah, Megan?
Awesome. And I know we've got some great questions. So I'm only going to take a minute or two of our time together. But hey, y'all, if we haven't met yet, my name is Megan. I'm based out of Orlando, Florida, and just wanted to share some quick next steps with y'all. As I know, right, we can start this conversation in an hour, but what this actually looks like in our neighborhoods and in our communities takes more time. And so if you want to be a part of what this looks like moving forward, I'll go ahead and share the opportunity that Eric mentioned earlier. We're doing another virtual session next Wednesday for civic leaders. It'll be an hour and a half, same time. But if you've got any officials or any city or county staff that you think would really benefit from learning more about ABCD, they can join us here and register at that link. I'll also say any of the resources shared in the chat along with the recording will be emailed out by the end of the week. So don't feel like you have to rush and copy and paste anything you see. We also are really excited to share with y'all that we've actually recently launched an online community for folks committed to inside out transformation in neighborhoods. And so it's called the Community Building Hub. If you're looking to join a community of other leaders across the country using asset-based and relationship-driven practices, this could be for you. And so I'll go ahead and drop the application form in the chat as well. I will say if you look over that application and that's not the best community for you, still reach out. I know we've got people here from the ABCD Institute, Neighboring 101, the Weaver Network, right, who all also have some really amazing communities. And so we want to get you plugged into the right place. So just reach out and we'll help make those connections. And then the last thing I'll mention, I know Eric said that we're going to host another webinar coming up on block connectors and what does it look like to really have a robust program. We've got a few people lined up, but we know there's a lot of people doing great work under the radar. If you know of any groups across the country who are really investing in block level social connection, please reach out, right? We would love to feature some groups that might be on the national level, but who are doing amazing work. All right, I will stop so we can get to Q&A.
Thank you, Megan. So Doug, any reflections on that question about the funding and partnerships to make this work?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. One is community foundations can be a great partner. Community foundations are often focused on, capacity building, lower income parts of town. So they're not necessarily an organization that could, that would help like an HOA that is middle class or whatever. But I think if you could ask them to focus on a community as a whole, they often have that community at heart. And then businesses. When I had a neighborhood resource center, it was called, that helped neighborhood associations with block parties. And we went to Safeway and we said, would you give us coupons that we could hand out to people so that when they have a block party, they could come to Safeway and get a couple of free items for their block party. And Safeway gave us coupons for 2 gallons of ice cream or 2 half gallons of ice cream, and then paper goods like plastic and paper goods for a block party. And people would take that to Safeway and they would get their free items, but then of course they would buy stuff while they were there. So Safeway was a good partner. Realtors are often good partners. I have seen neighborhood associations or neighborhoods where the realtor is the one that sponsors the block parties. And they put up their own signs for the block parties. And, if you've got a hot neighborhood in particular where there are realtors that kind of work that area, they can be really great partners. Or any local business that would like to cater to that area. And I think if you can make it tangible and show the benefits that they would get, it could be Home Depot. Target is a very decentralized funder. They focus only on their own areas, each individual target area. Um, so there are a lot of stores that do that kind of thing. Ace Hardware is a similar kind of community-based funder. I noticed that there's a local funder that funded our neighborhood community garden, and it's a restaurant. And I don't know how much they give, but having their name on it was worth supporting it. So think about the marketing angle in particular, beyond, like I say, community foundations.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. And also just folks, again, we can also crowdsource any of this. So if you have ideas, please feel free to share those, so we can, because we all are experts in our own context. Let's see. I do want to get to a couple of the questions in the Q&A box. How does creating an attractive relational environment where people want to organize and work together have value in human evolution needed now during this time of isolation polarization? Seems like we are at quite a crux point and need compelling reasons to access the better angels of our nature.
Yeah, great question. And, I mean, we all know the answer, that the benefits that come from getting to know each other, and the challenge is breaking the ice, right? I mean, it's people knowing that they don't have to talk about politics, that they can come and break bread over other topics, that they won't have to talk about, you know, Democrats and Republicans. Um, and that's where a community building project can be such a huge icebreaker, to have a neighborhood cleanup and get people to come out and, pick up trash or remove graffiti, or to have something that they can focus on. Um, and we give this advice to HOAs or neighborhood groups where there are conflicts, that if you can do something that is positive, that everybody will rally around, and it could be a community garden or a gathering place of some kind, or a cleanup campaign, that getting people feeling positive about something can really help break down that polarization. We mentioned animals at the beginning of the uh, webinar, pets, dogs and cats. Um, have a dog show, you know, get people to bring their animals, and or do this online where people are exchanging, do a Facebook group where people are exchanging pictures of their pets. There's nothing that brings people more positive energy. And you see this on nextdoor.com all the time, amongst all the negative stuff, is people will put animal pictures, pet pictures.
Great, thank you. And then Destiny asks, how would someone who lives in an apartment complex begin to engage and organize their neighbors? Can you mention on that?
Well, I know a HOA that does a weekly Friday afternoon happy hour. And, apartment complexes, I think, typically have a common area of some kind where people could gather, if you had a regular, or just try it once. It could be, the local football team playing or something where you gather people to celebrate a sporting activity or to come and bring their dogs and interact. But yeah, it's hard to break the ice and know that a lot of people are kind of private at first, but once you break through that veneer, um, they can be quite friendly. Other people are reluctant to have a relationship because they're afraid that it will be a burden. They don't want a close relationship. But I'm a real believer in the um, collective efficacy model that what's his name, Mark Granevelt came up with, where um, the strength of weak ties, Granovetter, um, weak connections among people create health, it creates financial well-being. So you don't need to be close friends. An annual block party is maybe all you need.
Yeah, great insight. Yeah, it's interesting, right? I mean, the research is that human beings, we always think that the other person is going to feel bothered by my reaching out. And yet the research is that when we step out of our comfort zone and we do that, people, I mean, people feel a richer, fuller life because of it. When you really,
Yeah,
it's just a
yeah,
dynamic that we just live with.
yeah.
Chad asks, how do we we'll make this our last question. It's the last question in the box here. We'll make it the last question. How do we effectively communicate to reach more of our immediate neighbors with the important information they find valuable, given so many of us are over inundated with information, emails, junk mail, social media, etc.?
Yeah. Yeah, I think just having that regular, maybe annual opportunity to chat. We have a block email list, but we use it sparingly. Um, we've been talking to Nextdoor as an organization to see if we might help them be a more positive influence and have micro groups like on a block level where people could interact. We haven't been able to do that yet, but I know that Facebook has that ability. You can have a group just of your own block. Um, but I think having a liaison with the city or having a block captain can help share information that would be critical to others. So if you can find one person that could also send that information around, and having those block emails can be really helpful if it's used sparingly and not as advertising or whatever.
No, that's great. I will say we had a couple more questions. Jay, I think you dropped one in the chat. Kristen, I see you dropped a question as well. We're going to need to wrap up, but again, I would invite you because we do these conversations every couple months. Bright spots. We also have one next week, like I say, like Megan pointed out. And of course, you can just make this an ongoing conversation if you feel you really fit that niche target or that niche group that's dedicated to relationally based, place-based change in your neighborhood. And you can join the hub, and that's another way to keep this conversation going. So, Doug, I just want to really appreciate you bring just such a wealth of experience and wisdom and insight, and this has been delightful. And I have loved what's happened in the chat because it's a representation of community. Neil sharing some research and Chet sharing about a resource for apartments with Destiny. Boy, wouldn't that be cool if every neighborhood we're sharing in this way, we could all get better as blocks, as neighborhoods, and then as cities. And then I think that gets to your vision,
Yeah.
Doug, of everyday democracy at play all the time, every day, solving local problems and celebrating local successes and local people. So, and create that community of care. So let's keep at it, folks. It's one exchange at a time, and let's just go forth this next week. Happy neighboring. And if and if you want your leaders at your community to understand what you're trying to do, bring them out next week to our next event, virtual again here on Zoom, and we'll keep the education going, keep the relationship building. And with that, thank you again, Doug. Any last words to close us out?
Well, I think this is the knitting that's holding our country together, frankly, is people in communities working together. And as much as we see the negatives on TV, I think the rest of us are still having a pleasant day on a regular basis. So,
Yes, wonderful. Thank you again, Doug. Truly grateful. And thank you to everybody for joining us, for spending time here, and we just wish you well in your endeavors.
Yeah, thanks for your work.
Best.